Hello and welcome back to this damnfully dualistic crusade. This is the next in my series, rereading and comparing the books in the classic Hardy Boys Canon original series. So in this video, I'm discussing the original and revised text of Book 18, The Twisted Claw. The 1939 original text was written by John Button, and the 1969 revised text was written by Tom Mulvey. This is part of the John Button era of the books and the original texts of the series, and this is unfortunately the area most fans agree is definitely the weakest point of the original text. It's probably also due to the actual outlines that Button was being given being very much a bit more out there and different compared to the first 16 books written by series primary writer and technically creator in a lot of ways, because all the books were ghostwritten, Leslie McFarlane. So when you're reading the original text and you get to one of the John Button books, you kind of know what you're in for, or if you're reading it for the first time, you should basically prepare yourself for it to be a book where the plot is basically not always the most sensical, if it's sensical at all, and Frank and Joe don't really always behave like themselves or sound like themselves, and tonally it's definitely a bit off, and elements kind of seem all over the place. That's what you run into when you first read the original text of Book 17, The Secret Warning, as I discussed in my last video. But here in The Twisted Claw, of the handful of John Button books, I think this is actually the one that is the most effective because it leans into the elements that make the original text unique and so much fun to come to if you've never read them before, if you're just used to the revised text. Here in the original text, you have all of that wonderful 1930s pulp magazine, pulpy adventure flavor, essentially. The danger factor that the boys get into, just like in the last book in terms of the original text written by Button, is very much top tier. So you get that sense of the boys really getting that gritty, two-fisted action element in there and almost getting killed a number of times. And while the action is certainly present and actually even increased in terms of the amount in the revised text, which is common to the text revisions, it doesn't have the same intensity to the action. So while the original text has a definite number of problems, most of which are similar to what we saw in the John Button original text of Book 17, and they're issues I think you'll find in all the John Button books around this era, which are basically in the original text, books 17 through 21 are the ones that he wrote that all have varying degrees of these issues. But again, I think the Twisted Claw is the one that hangs together the most because it has that pulp adventure flavor. It does move with a good pace, even though it has some of the same problems of Secret Warning, of the boys kind of going back and forth and backtracking quite a bit for a while, and has a significant portion of the book that kind of feels like meandering. It's a good read. It's an improvement over Secret Warning, and again, of the John Button original textbooks, I think it is the most successful, and certainly has moments that kids will always remember, and I think adults who read this particular version as kids will think back to the most iconic or over-the-top moments, as this book certainly goes out with a bang, and so much so that the revised text did have to retain a version of that, even though it is extremely watered down in terms of how it's staged and handled. To talk basically about the plot of the original text, which also describes most of what we see in the revised text, because this is one of the text revisions that keeps the basic idea of the plot and some of the iconography, but then kind of does its own thing with it and has a subplot. The original text is essentially dealing with the boy's father, Fenton Hardy, trying to put a stop to a smuggling ring that is operating on the high seas, and no one's been able to essentially nail them. The boys get involved when unfortunately, once again, as in Secret Warning, their father basically, for whatever reason, leaves some important papers around, and they have to get them to him. So we have another sort of trope repeated, but also they're told to get a rare book for him if they can find it. And in doing so, finding this rare book in criminology, they also stumble across this rare volume about essentially a group of pirates who use the sign of the Twisted Claw. Now, this is a book that is centuries old, essentially, and they just happen to stumble across it for some reason and are fascinated by it. But since this is specifically mentioned, you know, obviously, that since it has the title of the book, this is going to be very important and obviously play into the villains of the piece. So to say that the boys stumbling across this book in a bookshop just by chance is a coincidence is an understatement. It's definitely the major groaner moment of the book, because they just happen to stumble across this ancient volume that's the title of the actual book you're reading. So it's like, I wonder when this is going to come in handy. As in Secret Warning, there's quite a bit of business about the boys trying to get the papers safely away from various criminal factions that want to get them for some reason. So there's quite a number of pages about trying to keep them out of enemy hands. Again, just like in the last book, though thankfully it's not as much of a portion of the book devoted to that this time around. But essentially the boys journey up into and around the US-Canadian border, and then are essentially, for the entire middle section of the book, kind of wandering around Canada and the wilderness, in and around small towns and various logging camps, trying to run down leads on the smuggling operation, but also looking for their father, who they believe has been kidnapped or captured by the gang, and of course they turned out to be right, and then they have to essentially save their father in the middle of a really nice action sequence that turns into a raging forest fire, where the boys are even aided by the Canadian Mounties. So it's got a lot of nice visuals and some nice action moments, and the boys having to think on their feet. So it's all the elements that you come to expect and really appreciate the original text for. The problem in this book is that when you stop and think about it, you're kind of wondering why we're just basically following the boys wandering around the Canadian wilderness or around the U.S. northern border, kind of going back and forth, backtracking for a significant portion of time. It's not like they follow a lead and then sort of uncover the next part of the trail and then figure out their father's been kidnapped. You know, it just kind of meanders. And this is definitely the weakest section of the book, because it does take quite a bit of time, but it's nicely done enough. It doesn't drag, but it's definitely, after reading a number of chapters where it's just kind of more of the same, it does start to feel a little bit repetitive, and you kind of wonder, well, why are we still in the Canadian wilderness? Are we going to are we going to finish this section of the story? And it's definitely an example, I think, of something you'll run into in this era of the books, where the plot is not necessarily as focused as it should be. But again, it's well written enough, and at least the boys behave mostly like themselves. There's not anything that feels too off-kilter in terms of the actual characterizations, as I think there was a little bit of that in Secret Warning. So it is still an improvement, but I think the biggest shortcoming of this book, besides the unbelievable coincidence of the boys finding the essentially the history of the Twisted Claw pirates, is that they're spending most of the book sort of wandering around the Canadian wilderness. But after this point, all roads essentially point to a ship or a group of ships that are all operating strangely and not really following the standard codes, and they believe the ship that they've been following, the Black Parrot, is actually part of this smuggling group, and the boys essentially con their way on board and disguise themselves as workers and just try to learn what information they can. And this is also not a modern vessel. The book is from 1939, but the actual ship that they're on is still very much what you would expect, your traditional sailing ship, and the boys really have to work at it like they're hands on a pirate ship. And the theme of piracy is very apt, because what the book builds into for its climax, and this is definitely where the over-the-top, amazing 1930s pulp flavor comes from. This is not merely a smuggling gang. This is actually really, it's a centuries-old secret group of pirates that operate using different ships with various captains that try to loot as much as they can. Each one is amusingly named a different color of parrot. So there's the black parrot, the yellow parrot, the green parrot, I think, as well. But the boys basically are taken to the secret pirate kingdom that is on an uncharted island that has existed for centuries and has an entire city on it, syndicate that even has the Pirate King, and all of the members are part of the Order of the Twisted Claw, and they even have, in a wonderful pulpy touch, this identifier, this actual branding mark on one of their fingers that actually forms a twisted claw. So this is where the book goes into full pulp territory. Essentially, the ships dock and everyone is told to stay on board. Only the captains go in, and essentially they bring their loot and have their annual meeting, as it were, with the Pirate King. But of course, the boys sneak through barracuda-infested waters just with knives in their teeth at night and basically break into the city to observe essentially almost a sort of yearly Mardi Gras parade of all the pirate captains being brought in, and then sneak into the palace that is, again, centuries old, and see not only indoctrinations of members being given the branding of the Twisted Claw, but actually the meeting between the captains and the Pirate King. So that is the highlight of the book. That's the moment that everybody remembers who read this particular version growing up. And this is where any issues you may have had with the first 2/3 of the book are gone, because it is so wonderfully, gloriously over the top that it's basically the Hardy Boys go play pirates. It's basically a pirate story that just happens to be in 1939. So while it's definitely implausible in some areas, it's just plausible enough that there could be a secret group of pirates that has lasted for centuries, known as the Order of the Twisted Claw. So it's just plausible enough, and it has that wonderful energy of a 1930s pulp story that you would read in, say, a pulp magazine. So essentially, the boys have to figure out how to get away with their lives with this information, and how to even get word to their father or any authorities. It does have a nice bit of tension and drama, and even me just going over the secret pirate city is not technically a spoiler, because it is the most memorable part of the book. The other is the specific moment during this sequence that is depicted on all the covers and was replicated in the revised text, where the boys are looking at these incredible, ornate, historical pieces of armor, and of course one of them starts to actually move, which is of course a classic trope in many different genres, but beautifully done here. The only issue with the overall final act of the book is that when the boys do make their escape, the actual final bit of action on the island is actually done essentially kind of off screen, if you will, or it's not the focus. It's told in retrospect, so it does feel like a little bit of a letdown that the reader is not actually involved on the final raid. And also, the whole final act does feel a little bit rushed, because it is saved for the ending of the book. So we have quite a bit of detail of the boys working as hands on the ship and trying to not have their cover blown, and actually going through not one but multiple mutinies and storms at sea that nearly destroy the ship. So it is really well told, and again, very much the Hardy Boys Pirates edition. So it's beautifully done, and the boys nearly die many times, and that's the sort of wonderful sense of danger aspect you need in one of the original textbooks that you're never going to get in the revised text, at least to that degree. But the actual Pirate Kingdom and dealing with the Pirate King and trying to get out, it does feel a little bit rushed, because it takes so long to get there, and even though the original texts are longer books than the revised text, there's not many pages to play around with. It's such a fascinating setting that you want more detail. You want to know more of the lore, and how did this place survive for hundreds and hundreds of years, and learn more about all the people who live on the island, who are basically people who got shipwrecked and were never allowed to leave, and how they interact with the natives of the island, and how was the pirate palace built. It's a fascinating setting. You want to know more, and you just get your appetite whetted, because all this is basically just kind of crammed in to the final act of the book. And then you really wonder why we had to spend most of the book following the boys wandering around the Canadian wilderness in between logging camps. So again, there's a beautiful sense of pulp flavor to this, and I say pulp in the best sense of the word. So this has that 1930s action adventure quality to the extreme. It is very much what you come to expect from the original texts of the books, and it's well written enough that I don't think it has the issues as deeply felt as the other John Button books around this era. So of the Button books from basically 17 to 21, I think this is the strongest. I think it holds together the most. The boys are in consistent peril, and there are specific perilous moments where the boys are not only nearly killed, but these moments are also actually tossed aside and not used in the revised text. So, as usual, the original text, you feel the sense of danger much more. The book is much more of a two-fisted action type, but that's pretty much something you could label all of the original textbooks as. And of course, being written in the 1920s and 30s, they were obviously going to have that pure pulp fiction flavor to them versus the revised text. Now, for the revised text, you have essentially the same story, but it's been supplemented by an entirely new subplot, and also some of the actual events are moved around a little bit, but as is common to the revised text, when they keep the basic plot of the original, the intensity is dialed down a bit, and the amount of action in terms of sequences are piled on. So there is much more action, but it's not as deeply felt. And also you have the boys sort of going around on their own a lot more and having access to their father's private plane. So things like that in certain ways make the boys feel a little bit more like independent adult agents of sorts. And also it's easier in a way for them because they have a private plane they can just use and fly up to Canada and then investigate ships traveling at sea more. And there's a greater pace to the revised text, which is pretty much what you find in all of them. But we do have the main moments people remember. The most iconic bits from the original text are replicated, such as the Lost Pirate City and, of course, the suit of armor that moves. But essentially, the book starts exactly in the same way. The boys are at a local sporting event and realize they're having to deal with people essentially sort of tailing them. Their father has to sort of sneak out of the house without being seen as he is investigating essentially two different cases that actually become the two different subplots. One is dealing with smugglers, and the other is museums being robbed across the country that all share in common the fact that they have pieces from a single collection, the de Graw collection of various basically suits of armor and weaponry and other items from centuries ago that all bear the mark of a twisted claw. So again, you have the boys essentially doing legwork for their father, investigating the black parrot and its sister ship, the yellow parrot, and nefarious goings-on, also trying to find a book for their father, but nicely here, they merely stumble across the rare twisted claw volume, which is damaged and incomplete, but they're only allowed to look at it because it's so rare. They're not able to actually buy it. So that, I think, while it's still coincidental, it's just something they see that resonates in their mind, and because they could only look at it. It was such a rare antique volume, they couldn't afford it. So that's at least a nicer little tweak to make it at least slightly less coincidental that they happen to find this book that ties into the plot. But the boys do a lot more investigating of the parrot ships, which are now essentially modern cargo freighters. They slip on to one ship as stowaways, essentially, almost get killed and then are uncovered and have to be rescued by the Coast Guard after some not pleasant time aboard ship. And then we essentially transition into the Canadian wilderness once again as the boys are running down leads and trying to meet back up with their father. So you can recognize this as essentially an echo of the extended main portion of the original text, now nicely concise and focused. So this is another example of the revised text very much fixing problems of the original text when it repeats it. And while they are investigating the parrot ships at different intervals, they go to the various museums and try to prevent them from being robbed. They don't know which museum is going to be hit, so they all split up, and the boys bring along their friend Chet Morton. And interestingly, the museum robberies are quite interesting because they are nicely staged, and essentially every everyone is either knocked out by tear gas or knockout gas and are thus unable to figure out exactly how the heists were pulled off and what is it about this particular collection of armaments that are just really of historical interest. There's not really a major monetary value to them. It's unknown why this gang is robbing all these museums, let alone how exactly they do it. So in between the boys running down leads and also helping to investigate the museum thefts, they then decide to repeat the same trick of sneaking onto a ship disguised as workers. Now they're sneaking onto the Yellow Parrot and just trying to uncover more information about the gang. But unfortunately for them, the ship meets up with its sister ship, and the boys are going to be recognized. They do have to sneak off and actually get shipwrecked on an island, and further close calls happen before the boys are essentially once again finding themselves on an island where the pirate headquarters is. However, here it's nowhere near as developed, and the idea is that the head of the smugglers is essentially restarting the pirate group of his ancestors. And so now it's essentially a modernized version of what we saw in the original text. It's no longer a secret pirate group on a secret pirate island with a pirate king that has existed for centuries and gone through generational bloodlines. Here, it's the great descendant trying to basically restart this with his smuggling group and keeping various shipwrecked individuals imprisoned on this island. So it's at least hitting the same beats, but it's not as exotic by any means. It is modernized, so it's frankly more believable in that sense. And plus, this is being written in 1969, and the technology is a bit different, of course. So it doesn't have that same pulp spark to it. But if you're going to do the Twisted Claw, you obviously had to repeat a version of the secret pirate island to have that spark of adventure in the story. But again, it's a very watered down version. It's still good and it fits the revised text, but it lacks that wonderful over the top 1930s pulp flavor, that wonderful sense of the exotic that's in the final act of the original text. The revised text does lose out on quite a bit of that, and we don't spend as much time here on the island again because you have the subplot of the museum robberies and trying to tie the two together. And since the revised text moves at such a quicker pace and has a shorter page count, that also cuts down on the time spent on the secret pirate island. So the final act of the book is where you very much feel the lessening of the 1930s pulp aesthetics and the mashing together of the two plots, because now we have the subplot about the museum robberies, and while they are tied in together nicely, it just like the original text, the finale of this book does feel a little bit low-key. It's a bit anticlimactic, because once you get to the secret pirate kingdom island, you can't really top that, and the original text kind of ends on a whimper in a way, because the actual action is just sort of described and the boys and thus the reader aren't in on it. And the revised text actually ends more with the museum subplot instead of the pirate island. So the revised text is very much indicative of all of the aspects and design choices essentially of the revision process that the Stratemeyer Syndicate did to the books for the first 38 titles. So if you've read any of the revised text, or if you've done any of these comparison reads, everything I've been saying should sound pretty familiar with what you're used to. The revised text is, of course, much shorter to cut down on costs, but here you have essentially the original text replicated and modernized. The action is tightened up for that shorter page count and focus, so you don't have the problem of the very meandering second half of the original text, but you also have the inclusion of an entirely new subplot, and you have to wait for the point at which the two plots meet. They finally converge in the ending of the book, but there are enough linkages that do tie them together well enough so they don't feel like they're completely alien to one another. So this is an example of one of the revised texts that basically it takes the original plot of the original text and supplements it with a new subplot and adds many more action beats while also modernizing the technology and the setting to, along with the quicker pace, give a more consistent adventure in terms of the reading experience. So the revised text is obviously stronger than the original text in that regard. And in terms of the overall book's effectiveness, all of the revised texts are going to be better than the original text for the John Button books. That's just that's not even a question. But of these particular books, again, volumes 17 through 21 of the original text, the Twisted Claw is the one that holds together the best, and because it has all of that 1930s pulpy goodness to it, and again, secret pirate kingdom on a lost, uncharted island, and a pirate king with his members being branded with the sign of the Twisted Claw, and having an entire fleet of secret pirate ships carrying out his will, and chests of gold, and an entire pirate fortress in a centuries-old pirate palace, complete with parade into said palace. The original text has so much more flavor to it, but you have to deal with the fact that the writing is not as good as Leslie McFarlane, and that the actual outline itself that the writer was given isn't exactly up to snuff all the way through, but it's got enough wildness. That's the thing. It's got the wild spark of energy. That's what makes it so enjoyable. And of the John Button books, it is the best written and most effective, and thus the best book of the original text of 17 through 21. I don't hesitate in saying that because I've read these before, and they are definitely the weakest of the original 38 texts, and the other books are nowhere near as good or enjoyable as this one. And in particular, in the next book, The Disappearing Floor, the original John Button text goes off the deep end, and it is definitely the weirdest and most non-canonical Hardy Boys book of the original series, and is usually seen as the worst of the original texts, and one can definitely understand why. So it's remarkable that the original text of The Twisted Claw actually hangs together all the way through and manages to tell a good enough mystery story that's also filled to the brim with over-the-top action, set pieces where the boys nearly get killed many, many times, and essentially the boys get to play pirate, and it's believable and fun, and a full-on 1930s pulp experience. So, in comparing the two and trying to say which book is actually better than the other, this one, it's a bit of a draw, really, because it's easy to say the revised text is better because it is as a book in terms of plot, story construction, characterization, plot focus especially, and also the pacing is much quicker, and it's got a shorter page count, so it has to anyway. But the original text has that wild pulpiness to it. It's got that wild energy spark, and it goes over the top in moments in a good way. It's that good sort of, okay, we're sort of straining credibility here, but boy, this is fun. Again, there's a point at which the boys are told to stay on a pirate ship with the crew while the captains go in to have their meeting with the Pirate King and bring the chests of gold in, and the boys say, no, we're going to sneak on to the secret pirate island by stripping to our shorts, essentially, putting a dagger in our teeth and diving into barracuda and shark-infested waters in the middle of the night to try and infiltrate the secret pirate island. I mean, what's not to love there? That is a small little scene in the original text that you do not get in the revised text. You don't get anything with that level of pulpy goodness. That's the key distinction between the two texts. And the revised text does replicate all of the iconic moments from the book, so you can at least still get away with calling it The Twisted Claw, and it's still technically the same story. It does feel watered down to a degree for the actual pirate main plot of the original text. So both books are good in their own way. The revised text is the stronger of the two overall as a book. It is the better written book. It is the better constructed book. It is the better executed book. But the original text is so much fun and has such pulpy goodness that it's really a draw between the two. technically the revised text is the better of the two, but it does not have that same degree of that wonderful 1930s flavor to it. So this is an example where I think each of the texts has their own unique strengths that are representative of the time in which they were written in terms of the style of what the books were at the time in which they were written. Now let's talk a little bit about the cover artworks. We have three. The original by Paul Launey. Again, I'm never sure how to pronounce that, so I don't know if it's Launey or just Lawn, but he did a number of covers around this era. So the original 1939 cover is depicting the event that is depicted on all the covers of the boys seeing an ornamental suit of armor with the Twisted Claw logo that suddenly starts to move. So it's a very wonderfully atmospheric moment. It's perfect for a book cover, although I've always been a little surprised that they always go with this for the cover image, because it's a striking moment and it's also a genre cliche, but it's nowhere near the biggest moment. I mean, again, you have secret lost city pirate kingdom with a pirate king. And at least a version of that in both texts, and you don't use that for the cover, so that's kind of interesting. But here it's 1939, so it's again the cover design for the Hardy Boys sort of straddling two different fences in terms of they've got a new attempt at doing the logo, so we have the logo and the title in this red oval, which was not really used all that much. So that gives this cover the distinction of being one of those that they kind of tried something else and it kind of sets it apart from the others. The actual depiction of the boys is pretty good, although it looks like Joe Hardy does not have his blonde hair because Frank and Joe do not have the same hair color, but it looks like they do on this. And also, interestingly, they've got perfectly slicked hair and they're dressed in suits, but in the actual book, they had to sneak on to the actual island. But the actual design is nice, although the actual staging and composition makes the suit of armor look a little bit small and less imposing. And also, you can't quite make out the Twisted Claw on the breastplate that's supposed to be red. But overall, this is a good cover. I like that the background is green, which contrasts with the red of the title oval. And then we have the sort of ornate door suggesting they are in a historical place. So, it works. It's good. There's a little bit of shadow to give it a sense of menace and things, but I kind of look at this as almost a sort of placeholder cover because it replicates the event from the book, and it's interesting enough, but it kind of looks more like they're in a museum instead of the Lost Pirate Kingdom, and that's rather ironic because this cover more fits the revised text with the museum subplot and having the suits of armor in the museums that are being robbed. Whereas when we switch to the second cover, which was done by John Leone in 1962, this basically fixes all my issues with the first cover. It's the same moment, except now the image is much more ominous and the orientation has been flipped. So now the suit of armor is on the left, but now it's got the visible, large, bold red Twisted Claw on the breastplate as the story describes. The figure looks much more menacing and is actually holding the weapon out towards the boys, so it looks like it has just come to life, and this very much depicts what happens in the actual moment in the story. The boys are much more on edge. It looks like they're about to try and dive out of the way, and now the hair color is actually correct, but once again they're dressed in suits, which, while that would have been what proper boys were supposed to look like on a 1962 book cover, it's not how they would appear in the actual story. But I won't nitpick about that. The actual design of the background, we still have shadow in the top half of the image, which is good, but the actual details, it looks much more like the historical ancient pirate palace they find themselves sneaking through. And again, it looks like the boys have been sneaking around and they've just been confronted by a suit of armor that's moving and coming at them. So this is much more evocative of the scene from the book. I think it is an improvement, but you will note that there is all this dead space in the top half of the image, and the actual title is just kind of stuck on the top there with the white font, and then the Hardy Boys in red just kind of blends in to the image. So this is also an issue that you run into with the cover artworks around this time, where they're usually very well done, very detailed, but there's usually a lot of dead space in them somewhere. And so that in certain covers around this time kind of gives a little bit of a plainness to them, especially with the title and logo just kind of just slapped on the top and just like it was tacked on there. But of the covers of this era, I think this is one of the strongest examples, and I do think it is a distinct improvement over the first cover. It just doesn't have that 1930s aesthetic. Then finally we have, I think, the most iconic cover, the 1969 Rudy Nappy cover done for the revised text that has been used ever since on editions. This is very much in keeping with Nappy's covers around this time period for both the Hardy Boys and Nancy Drew. We have a very bold color background, and then the title is in this sort of lime green, so it really jumps out. But here, ironically, this cover seems the most evocative of the boys finding themselves kind of walking into the lion's den, of sneaking through the secret pirate kingdom and knowing they could be killed if discovered at any minute. The detail of the armor is really interesting and very evocative of how it's described in the book. We have the red twisted claw on the breastplate. We have the actual figure inside the armor. The eyes are watching the boys, so it's before it actually moves, but it gives this really ominous feeling. This is the most ominous of the three covers, and that really goes hand in hand with the bold color usage, and the sense of space on the top is now giving the actual environment an otherworldly historical feeling. Again, this looks like the boys have just come into a dungeon in a lost pirate kingdom. You know, it looks like they've stepped into another world, and the bold red and the figure actually already looking at them, holding a weapon in his hand, like he's about to attack them, and the boys are back to back about to essentially, try and fight for their lives. You know, it's got a real tension to it that was only suggested in the first two covers, I would say. And what's even more ironic about this, the revised text has this happen in one of the museums, not on the pirate island. So it's ironic that the best cover of the book, I think, is for the revised text, but it's one of the revised text covers that can actually work for both texts. The only thing that clashes with the original text is that the boys are very much in their late 60s, early 70s style in terms of how they looked on the covers, but also their clothes and haircuts do very much suggest late 60s, early 70s. That's the one element that dates this and makes it sort of clash with the original 1939 text. But the image is so good, the composition, the color, the boldness of the overall image, and it's the most ominous of the covers, that it actually can work for the original text, and I think is without question the best of the three artworks. In terms of editions in my collection, this first one, I don't have the dust jacket, so it makes it hard to specifically date, but it is seemingly a 1950s edition with a version of the iconic logo, but instead of having the brown tweed, this has more of the brown tan and sort of, it's hard to describe, but it's almost a sort of plasticky finish on the actual hardcover boards of the book, but it's still pretty solid in terms of overall shape. We have the iconic orange Greta in papers, and again, this seems to be about an edition that would have been in the early to mid 1950s, would be my guess. We have the front piece artwork, which has the scene from the original text. This is basically the major death trap that is omitted, or at least changed or to a completely different event involving logs in the revised text. So we have the original copyright page and chapter listing, and then the first page itself. For the original text, I have a lovely picture cover example with the second cover artwork. This is in rather nice condition, doesn't have a lot of fading or issues with the cover art, and is nicely printed, so it looks much bolder than the sort of flatter image you'll see looking up the book online. And again, it really lends itself well to the dimensions. And I think the title actually looks a little bit better when you see a copy in person because the actual color and text actually stands out from the image. But it's just a really nice looking example of a 60s picture cover. Of course, we have the spine, and then the rear, which lists all the way to Secret Agent on Flight 101, which actually dates this to about 1967. So this is a rather late example for the original text to still be printed. So shortly after this point, this book would no longer exist and would only be available in the revised text version in a picture cover. Of course, we have the classic, iconic brown and white end papers. This is the later front piece artwork that depicts the major action set piece from the original text that's not really replicated, where Frank has to rescue Joe, who has been tied to a log and sent down the river to his death at a logging camp. Of course, we have the original date of 1939 on the copyright page, and then the contents, which list the final chapter to over the 200-page mark, which is always indicative of it being an original text, and then the original style and font in terms of the layout of the original text. Then for the revised text, I just have my flashlight edition from childhood. So this has the Rudy Nappy artwork. It's been nicely printed, so you get that nice boldness of the color, especially the red and the sort of lime green of the title, but it's been altered and cropped to fit the flashlight aesthetic, so we no longer have the Hardy Boys logo in white on the top. It has the same uniform design as all the flashlight editions, and thus the same uniform rear cover. Then we have the new front piece artwork, which essentially is what replaces the near death by logs from the original text. Here it's Frank as a stowaway in the hold of one of the ships as the logs break loose in transit. Here we have the modern copyright. It's printed on recycled paper, as all the flashlight editions usually are. This is a 1999 printing, so it's well made and solid compared to later printings. And then, of course, the revised text chapter listing, which, of course, indicates it's a much shorter book. And, of course, this follows with the revised text style and layout of the text. Of course, the revised texts also have their iconic internal illustrations, and you can actually kind of tell this is obviously from at least the late 60s, early 70s, because the internal illustrations by this point had changed and in terms of their style, so this very much marks this as a 1969 revised text. Here, Frank tours the collection he's been sent to guard from being robbed. Here, the boys plan to disguise themselves to get a job working on one of the ships. Of course, you have to have the boys falling down a secret trapdoor somewhere. Here, the boys and their father, Fenton Hardy, wait in vain, hoping for a radio message secretly sent from one of the ships. And that's it. And once again, no imagery of the island with the secret pirate kingdom on it, which is a real missed opportunity that not only was it never used as a cover image, but even when it was replicated to a lesser extent in the revised text, we didn't even get one of the internal illustrations of the pirate island. So those are my thoughts overall on the original 1939 text and the 1969 revised text of Book 18 in the Hardy Boys series of The Twisted Claw. This is one of the more pulpy action-oriented of the original series, regardless of which text you read. It is a classic in its own right in both text iterations, but it's a very good example of obviously the issues with the John Button era of the original text, and I do think it is very easily the best of those. It's the most effective one. So when you're reading the original text, it can be a bit of a slog when you get to 17 through 21, but at least the Twisted Claw is solid and enjoyable because you definitely need that because the next book, the original text of The Disappearing Floor, is just bizarre. It is absolutely bizarre, so that's going to be an interesting video for next time. So at least you have the fun, over-the-top, pulpy aspects of the Twisted Claw to enjoy before getting to that book. But the revised text does have a nice new subplot that is sewn neatly into the revision of the original plot that they're using. And there's enough fun elements that also tie the revised text into the then modern version of the series that really sort of of got relaunched in 1959 when the revisions were started on the first 38 books to then match what was being done by the Stratemeyer syndicate on books 39 onwards in terms of the individual book volume numbers. So that way, by the time the revisions were finished, you had a set of the 58 books that were known as the canon that all basically flowed into one another to a general degree, but never had quite the spark or the liveliness of the original text of the first 38. So this is a good example of the revised text keeping the original text and keeping the notable moments, but just tweaking them and maybe lessening the intensity and moving the order around to accommodate the new subplot being fused into the book and adding more action and up to date at the moment in the late 60s, technical aspects and other modes of transit and things to modernize the books for kids reading it in the late 60s, early 70s. So as always, I hope my babblings about the classic Hardy Boys series, the different texts and revisions and cover art designs and just collecting the books has been really somewhat fun and informative. This is definitely the best way to relive the books or have a fresh experience with them if you've never read both texts of the first 38 books. If you read them back to back, it makes very much apparent the changes the revisions made and also the approaches and what the individual author decided to do and in terms of the overall flavor and tone of the book. It's fascinating to see how much of the original was retained or what light allusions or echoes of the original text you get scattered throughout the revised text. So no revised text is completely without some connection to the original text, but sometimes those connections are very, very minor, and you will only notice them if you read both books back to back. But it is a real eye-opener. It is the best way to make the series fresh again if you're rereading them or you're reading them as an adult years later, coming back to the series. There's nothing quite like this in literature, really, in terms of an entire series being rewritten from the ground up with differing aspects for each book with different authors done out of order over an extended multi-year period. And this also goes for the Nancy Drew books at the time. So it is a fascinating study to do, even if you're just looking at it from the literary side. But it will make reading the books fresh again, doing a comparison read like this. So I encourage all fans to try it at some point. So my next video, of course, will be on book 19, The Disappearing Floor. And that one's going to be a real doozy because, again, it's no secret. The original text of The Disappearing Floor is the most bizarre, off-kilter, off-the-wall Hardy Boys book in existence in terms of the original text. It really does not read like a Hardy Boys book at all. It delves into science fiction territory, which is an area the series does not need to go into. It feels alien from the sort of Hardy Boys rule book. This was the book written where it's quite obvious there was no sort of series Bible for people to follow. So the next video will be quite interesting because it is the book that pretty much every fan can agree on is definitely the weirdest, and the revised text basically does its own news story, but only keeps some of the iconography in order to keep the title, The Disappearing Floor, and it's all the better for it. So it's an interesting case, and definitely the wildest, most out there of all of the original texts. So that will be an interesting discussion in the next video. But as always, please do keep reading the classic Hardy Boys series and also supporting your local independent bookstores by hopefully being able to pick up some lovely new editions for your collection. Keep reading print books, and as always, thank you ever so much for watching.